Hello everyone. Today I have something very special on the bench. What we have here is what is known as an Atmos clock. Designed and made by LeCoultre since 1928, they are some of the finest clocks ever mass-produced and are sought after by collectors all over the world. You may be wondering why that is. Well, most are plated with 24-karat gold, they are 100% mechanical and have exquisitely made parts. They have a handsome design, and you can view more than 90% of the working parts from almost any angle. Oh yeah, they are also designed to wind themselves automatically. That's right, theoretically they should never have to be wound. This is accomplished by utilizing the daily change in temperature, which causes a gas to expand and contract inside the bellows, thus winding the mainspring. Despite their size, most Atmos models have movements that are fairly small and not much larger than a standard pocket watch, which makes them extremely delicate. Any bit of dust, dirt, or crud in the movement can stop it. Because of this, they usually require servicing after a period of time. And today I'm going to show you how I perform a basic service to these fine timepieces. However, due to the extremely delicate nature and intricacy of these clocks, I feel the need to make the following statement as a disclaimer. Do not attempt what you are about to see here unless you have been specifically trained by a professional and have the proper tools to service these clocks. No part of this video should be viewed as training material unless stated otherwise. If you do attempt a service based on what you see here, you do so at your own risk. Now on to the service. We start by removing the case, which is done by flipping the clock upside down and removing the 4 screws from the bottom. I didn't show this, but always make sure the pendulum is locked before moving your clock. To keep the glass panels and supports together, I'll use some painter's tape. This can also be accomplished by using a large rubber band as well. Gently lift the case off the base and set it in a safe place. Now we need to remove the bellows canister from the back of the clock. There are 2 nuts that hold it in place that need to be removed. While on its back, the canister should be supported to keep the clock fairly level. Then we can gently lift the clock, making sure the spring on the back comes out nice and easy. After setting the bellows aside, we can lay the clock back down again to remove the hands and the dial. Removing the hands requires a special tool made specifically for Atmos clocks. Any attempt to remove the hands without this tool will most likely result in snapping off the minute post, which would be a very costly mistake. Once the minute hand is removed, the hour hand is a friction fit and can be twisted off, but be careful around that minute post. Now we can begin removing the dial. There are 4 screws holding it on that need to be removed. This must be done carefully because any slip of the screwdriver can damage the dial. It's best to use high-quality, good-fitting screwdrivers from this point on. I use a watchmaker's mindset while working on an Atmos. Extreme care should be practiced at all times while performing any operation or handling any parts. You know, it's kind of funny. I've been working on clocks for over 20 years, and when I first became interested in performing a service to an Atmos a couple of years ago, I was strongly advised against it by other colleagues, citing essentially what my disclaimer says at the beginning of the video, and then some. However, after a lot of research and some personal instruction by a couple close clockmaker friends of mine, I have become quite comfortable working on them. And after successfully servicing over a dozen of these, I actually find them to be rather fun and relaxing to work on. But anyway, back to the task at hand. Removing the movement is quite a delicate operation, as I need to be cautious around the minute post and the fork sticking out the top. Sometimes the movements need a little coaxing by gently prying it off with a screwdriver. You'll notice I'm holding the second wheel behind the movement. Once the movement is off, the mainspring will want to immediately unwind, so I'm holding it so I can gradually let down the mainspring afterward. This section will need to be addressed as well, so I will start by removing the tension spring. This entire back assembly is the power center of the clock, and also where the self-winding takes place. Once the spring is unhooked, I can then remove the pin holding the chain to the rear plate. I like to note which link the pin runs through as I try to put it back in the same place. However, there is a specific measurement required between the back plate of the movement and the spring plate that can be checked later during the reassembly. Now that all the springs are removed or unwound, I can now remove this front plate so that I can access the mainspring and the second wheel. Some people remove this entire assembly from the base of the clock. However, I found it safer for the pendulum to simply leave it attached. This way, the pendulum can stay locked in place to prevent damage to the suspension spring. These clocks are very well built and have very close tolerances in the way they're constructed, which can make working on these challenging for even the most seasoned clockmaker. Now the second wheel and mainspring can be removed, taking care around the two clicks that are positioned at an angle towards the back of the clock. And with that, we're done with this section and can set it out of the way in preparation for disassembling the front part of the movement. I'll use some high-grade watchmaker's screwdrivers for this part, as we want to have the best fit possible on the screws to prevent damage. This is one of the more tedious portions of the disassembly and is best accomplished while using this specifically designed movement holder to help prevent damage to the parts, especially the fork. Once the screws are removed, we can carefully pry up the front plate to access the wheels inside. This is a crucial step, and must be done cautiously as we don't want to bend or break any pivots or the brittle jewels. Now we can start carefully removing the parts, starting with the pallet and fork. It fits between two wheels and is removed by sliding it out the top. With how small and delicate these parts are, this clock sort of bridges the gap between clockmaker and watchmaker, as it utilizes procedures and tools used in both trades. I'll then remove these two bridges from the back plate of the movement. It's not totally necessary to remove these, but I like to make sure everything gets as clean as possible. This next step can be a bit of a controversial topic. Using a custom-made punch, I'll tap out the critical center shaft bushing so the hour wheel can be removed. Now, I've seen several instances where people tend to avoid doing this. Granted, this part is very hard to find if broken or distorted, but I feel it's necessary to make sure things are clean underneath. The only part I tend to avoid removing is the fourth wheel, because the wheel on front is tough to remove and I don't want to damage the jewel it fits through. The final section of the disassembly is tackling the mainspring, which must be removed from the barrel. To do this, we'll remove the 4 screws along the lip to separate the barrel from the wheel. Then the mainspring can be manually removed. There is no need to use a mainspring winder, since these springs are quite weak and fairly easy to remove and install by hand. Once it's removed, we then take out the additional bridle spring, which helps keep the outer edges of the mainspring held against the inside wall of the barrel. And now that the disassembly is complete, it is now time to run the parts through the cleaner. There are many ways to clean the parts. However, the best method I've found is to use a watch cleaning machine using a special cleaning solution that won't harm the lacquered finish. Since the cleaning baskets are rather small, it takes several cycles to complete this process. It is also important to keep delicate parts from getting damaged, so I put some of them into small closed baskets. The last cycle I run is with the pallet fork, which I put into a basket by itself to avoid other parts bumping into it and damaging it. While the parts are being cleaned, I'll check the condition of the bellows by measuring the depth between the edge of the canister and the center of the bellows themselves. These bellows are well within the healthy range and should wind the clock as intended. With all the parts cleaned and showing off their brilliant luster, it is now time to reassemble the clock. Going pretty much in reverse, I'll start by reinstalling the mainspring, which must be lubricated beforehand with a light film of oil. As with removing it, the reinstallation is completed by hand, making sure it is properly secured on the barrel hook. After that, the barrel can now be reattached to the main wheel. Using some Rodico, I'll clean up the barrel arbor pivots. It's vitally important that these, as well as all the pivots, are as clean and polished as they can possibly be. Luckily, there's almost never any significant wear to these parts due to such little power being applied to them, so it's quite rare to have to manually polish any of these during an overhaul. Now the hour wheel and minute hand bushing can be carefully reinstalled. The bushing must be seated properly to allow enough room for the hour wheel to freely rotate, but not too much room or it won't engage properly with the intermediate wheel on the front of the movement. With that out of the way, I can now start to reassemble the movement. This is where things get a bit tricky, as there are some small and delicate parts inside these plates that I'd much prefer to not damage in any way. As I mentioned earlier, this is where the watchmaker's mindset comes into play. Everything must be carefully positioned and double-checked often to ensure proper orientation before even attempting to install the front plate. I'll carefully set the front plate into position, then I'll make extra sure the pivots are seated properly in their jewels. The trickiest one is definitely the escape wheel, as those pivots are super tiny. Once I think everything is seated, I'll give the larger wheel a push to see if everything rotates freely. Then the screws can be installed. After flipping the movement over, I can now install the pallet fork. This part is super delicate and must be positioned very carefully. I need to make extra sure the pivots are placed in the jewels properly before tightening down the bridge. I'll use this styrene stick to help keep it in position while I tighten the screws. And with that, the movement is now assembled and ready for installation. But before that can be done, I need to address a few things first, starting with reinstalling the assembled mainspring in the second wheel. It's important that the chain responsible for winding the clock to not be twisted, so I'll carefully guide it onto the small pulley mounted on the back of the clock. Once the second wheel is installed, I can then set the front plate on, position the pivots in their holes, which I cleaned off screen, and then screw it down. Now it's time for the last major tricky part, and that is to reattach this coiled spring and cover plate. The reason this is so tricky is that I need to fit the chain through the small hole in the cover plate while compressing the spring, so that I can secure it into place using the small angled pin through the chain. Since I know the cover plate was in the correct position prior to disassembly, I'll reinstall the pin in the same link I took it out of. Now I can compress this spring again while pulling on the smaller coiled tension spring so that I can get it into position and secure it to its post. This is what the winding assembly looks like up close, showing both springs and the pin in their proper position. The last step before I can attach the movement is to set the beat. This is accomplished by first unlocking the pendulum and letting it come to a complete rest, then visually note where the roller is positioned between the two banking pins. We want the roller to be exactly in the center and front facing. Oh, and one more thing. I also like to put a tiny droplet of oil on the second wheel pivots. Now I can install the movement, being careful to not accidentally bend the fork. I found it's best to do this with the roller in the center position and carefully positioning the fork directly on top of it. This eliminates accidentally getting the fork on the wrong side of the roller. I am now ready to start testing the clock's operation. I'll first make sure it's level using the bubble level in front of the pendulum. Then I'll wind the clock a bit by pumping the spring on the back 4 times. I'll unlock the pendulum, carefully rotate it 270 degrees to its starting point, and then let it go. This is the moment of truth here. As the roller interacts with the fork, I want to make sure power is being applied partway through. Like that, right there. Did you see the fork bounce to the left as the roller started moving through? I'll observe that again as it comes back around. There we go. A quick snap like that is just what I'm looking for. That's a good sign that power is flowing through the movement. All that is needed now is to let it run for a day or two and see what kind of motion we have after that. After letting it run for a couple of days, I'm very satisfied with how it's running and believe it's now time to finish the assembly. I'll lock the pendulum, which is best done when the pendulum reaches the apex of its rotation and stops. It's best to wear nitrile gloves during a service. I know, shame on me. But regardless, I always make sure to wipe down all the parts I touched with a soft cloth or microfiber, as well as touch up smaller parts using Rodico. Now I can begin reattaching the bellows by carefully setting the tension spring inside while lining up the mounting studs. Then I'll put the nuts on the studs and snug them down. The dial pan can then be installed, followed by the dial face and paper backing. Then the hands can be fitted, and again, being careful around that minute post. I'll give the minute hand a few turns to make sure everything is working correctly. Then I'll do some touching up with some Rodico to remove any fingerprints or skin oils. After which I'll wipe down the bottom of the case as well as anywhere I can readily access. Before putting the top section of the case back on, I'll test run the clock again for an hour or so to make sure it's still functioning correctly. Once I'm satisfied the clock will function normally, I'll then reattach the top part of the case after wiping down the glass and the supports. After that, I'll set the time and test run it for a couple of weeks to ensure accurate timekeeping. Once that is done, it is then finished and ready to be reunited with its owner. Thanks for coming along with me on this project. These Atmos clocks are really challenging, yet also enjoyable to work on. It is truly a pleasure to be able to share this craft with you, and I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I had making it. As a side note, I do offer Atmos servicing to the general public as well as watches. If you wish to learn more about the services that I offer, come on over to my Facebook page and shoot me a message. In the meantime, be sure to like the video if you did, and subscribe to my channel for more content. Take care and have an amazing day.